Being abused is a difficult situation to be in. I don't know anyone who is abused and can walk away with absolutely no damage. Somewhere along the line on your journey of life, you are going to experience some kind of trauma. It could be complex PTSD, it could be PTSD, it could be major depressive disorder, anxiety, OCD, it could be just about anything. Abuse derails you from being on a stable foundation in your life. It takes your mind, it takes your heart, and it definitely steals your soul. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about the different kinds of abuse that you may not have heard of, and I'm going to mix in some common forms of abuse, and then I'm going to highlight personal boundaries and how to examine where you are. Before we jump in, just let me briefly introduce myself in case you are new to my channel. My name is Tamara. I'm internationally and I'm board certified in trauma therapy. I'm licensed in mental health. I specialize in treating children, teens, and families, as well as adults who are dealing with trauma. Let's jump in. Anytime I have to talk about the topic of abuse, it's really hard for me to narrow it down to specific, traits and behaviors and attitudes and experiences, because the topic of abuse is very, very broad. There's a couple of types of abuse you may not have heard of, and I'm going to highlight that in this video. But the topic is so it's so broad, and there's so many different forms of abuse. It's difficult to categorize them all. Abuse is a topic that requires more attention than it gets, especially in the field of psychology. I remember going through graduate school over 12, 14 years ago, I'll say, and I didn't get any graduate school classes that specifically talked about the impact of abuse and the different kinds of abuse that there is. It was only when I went to a psychiatric hospital to work as an intern that I was able to fully understand the topic of abuse. Now that I'm in private practice, I look at my clients, some of them, and I find it interesting that they have survived some of the abusive situations that they have been in. I know you're probably interested in the different forms of abuse, so let's just get to it, right? Let's jump in. So the first form of abuse that there is that you may not have heard of is spiritual abuse. Now, I want you to think of spiritual abuse as religious abuse. And here's what happens. The Bible is used against you, not necessarily by somebody who's abusive. It could be by somebody who's well-meaning, but the Bible is used to either categorize you, manipulate you, or harm you in some fashion. Consider this. Let's say you're a part of a cult, right? And it isn't one of the most talked about religions in the country. So you're in this small sect or this small cult. And the leader of that cult uses a manual, a book, or even the Bible to point out specific scriptures or specific passages or pages to manipulate your mind and to manipulate your emotions. It is not done necessarily to put you back in line. So here's an example of putting you back in line. Let's say you grew up in a Christian household. Your mom and your father both feel that you have left the Christian faith. And, you get upset with them and you start to curse them out. And you call them all kind of names, and you point fingers at them, and you manipulate them, and you triangulate, right? Maybe not intentionally, but this is something that you do. Your father, as the man of the house, and possibly as a bishop or a pastor or reverend, may turn to you and say, the Bible says, honor thy mother and thy father, that thy days will be many. Right? That is not necessarily spiritual abuse, and that is certainly not religious abuse. What's happening there is pretty difficult to identify, right? Because there's a thin line between spiritual abuse and reinforcement of a religious value or moral or truth. Okay? So in that scenario, I think your father would be using spiritual or religious reinforcement. They are reminding you of keeping your standards, keeping your values, and staying in touch with your faith. If it's spiritual abuse or religious abuse, those scriptures are going to be used, or any kind of manuals or chapters or books are going to be used to highly manipulate your mind and your heart. And it may manipulate you so much that you don't don't realize that you're in a trance-like mindset, that you're being manipulated and abused with that particular chapter, scripture, book, manual, whatever it is. Spiritual abuse has to be separated from reinforcement of Christian values, reinforcement of, Catholicism, reinforcement of spiritual principles. Religious abuse causes emotional, psychological, and sometimes physical abuse and harm. Okay, think of Jim Jones. That's what I want you to think about. The next type of abuse that you may not have heard of is immigration status abuse. That means that you may be a part of a family, you may be a part of a neighborhood, or you may be a part of an organization that goes behind your back and destroys your immigration papers, destroys your passports, does something that gets you reported to the law, has you arrested, reports that you're working under the table, right? Immigration status abuse. That kind of abuse is completely disgraceful, because the whole idea behind that kind of abuse is this: your citizenship is a shaky ground, and so therefore I'm going to use that against you. Here's an example of that. Let's say you're in a relationship with someone who is a US citizen, and you happen to be from France, or you happen to be from the UK. You come to the United States, for example, you like this woman, you're engaged to marry this woman, but you're still working on your citizenship. She gets angry one day because she's jealous of your relationship with your mother. You guys get into this big argument, and now she's threatening to call your immigration or the immigration facility or governmental agency, that could, maybe have you shipped back to your country. Okay. Or she reports something that maybe you both have been hiding for so long, or she tells them that you're, disregarding some law at that time. The next kind of abuse, which can sometimes cross over into the theory of gangstalking, is technological abuse. Now, technological abuse is this: I'm using social media, I'm using text messages, phone calls, email addresses, whatever I can use against you or use to abuse you or manipulate you or hold something over your head. Okay? Technological abuse can also consist of stalking, going online and cyber stalking, cyber bullying, finding photos and reposting them with inappropriate pictures, putting a tape out there that you have of the person that doesn't belong to you, right? Stealing their passwords or taking their private information and posting it online. All of that is technological abuse. All forms of abuse, and I probably should have mentioned this at the very beginning, all forms of abuse have some negative and unhealthy intent. The whole idea is to harm you. The other forms of abuse that you are probably aware of is physical, emotional, psychological, domestic violence. Okay, so let me summarize those briefly. So emotional and psychological abuse can take the form of lying to you and manipulating you, triangulating, playing the victim, gaslighting, stonewalling, refusing to talk. Your defenses are way up here, right? Creating arguments when there shouldn't be any kind of a problem between the two of you or the three of you or whoever you're arguing with. All of that is psychological and emotional abuse. There's also verbal abuse, right? So profanity being used towards you or all around you without any respect for your values or your personal space. Yelling and screaming, talking about matters that were part of your past and not your now moment. But it's being used, your past is being verbally used to embarrass you, minimize you, or make you feel disgraced in some form or fashion. And of course, we know that domestic violence or physical abuse is just physical, right? There's a lot of hitting and kicking and spitting and biting, and the list goes on, right? Beating up an individual, a spouse, that kind of a thing. We can also put in there physical bullying. That is also a form of abuse. Now, another form of abuse is known as financial abuse. And that's when somebody might take your finances and either withhold them, manipulate them, conceal them, right? You don't know what's in your bank account because somebody's in charge of it. Or they hold your money back where you can't get to it. I once had a client whose husband was psychotic. He was dealing with delusions, which are false beliefs held to be true despite evidence to the contrary, right? There's evidence against that delusion, but you still believe it. And her husband was delusional. He also had hallucinations that would tell him to do things, right? So he would hear something telling him to do something. One day, he went into he and his wife's joint account, and he took so many thousands out, deposited all those thousand into his own bank account. I think it was about $17,000 he took in and banked, right? He put it in his own personal bank account. And then he changed the PIN number and the account number of their joint account. When his wife went to withdraw money at the bank, she was told that the PIN was changed and that the bank account was changed as well. And that she only had about $3,000 left in that bank account. Why? Because her husband was physically, emotionally, psychologically abusive towards her. And the only way that he could continue to control her every move is to leave her with $3,000, but also make the point, because she couldn't get in, make the point that he has control over her because she didn't know the PIN number and she didn't know the account number. Okay, so that is financial abuse. Now you may be wondering, what does boundaries have to do with this? Well, you know, sometimes if you're being abused, you have to figure out, where is my boundary, right? Is my boundary here? Is my boundary way back here and that's too far away from the situation, right? Or am I overly involved? Am I too rigid, right? So understanding your boundaries is, to me, and I tell this to my clients, one of the most important steps toward healing and getting out of that abusive situation. So understanding your boundaries is important, right? So let's take a look at your boundaries. Let's see what you are. So there's often three categories of boundaries that you need to be aware of. One category is rigid boundaries. Rigid boundaries, they are difficult to maneuver, to move, to become flexible, to manipulate. It's really difficult when you have rigid boundaries. Rigid boundaries may look like pushing intimate relationships away, concealing or hiding information, being very protective of personal information, personal space, keeping others at a distance and making sure that you don't get emotionally and psychologically involved, having very few close relationships and friendships and family relationships. You kind of keep everybody at a distance, right? They're out that way. You talk to them, you engage, but they're way over there, you know? So that is a rigid boundary. The other kind of boundary is known as a porous boundary. And that's kind of where you overshare personal information. You're pretty loose with your life in the sense that you'll put whatever you want online. You'll show your body online. You'll give all your thoughts online. You express all of your emotions online in a very public space. You have difficulty saying no or wait a second, right? You have a hard time kind of being independent, right? So you may be rather dependent in some ways on other people. You may also find it hard to set your own boundaries in a healthy way, right? So somebody with porous boundaries constantly needs somebody with healthy boundaries to correct them. That's too much personal information. You're stepping over the line right there. You probably shouldn't touch that person, that kind of a thing, right? You may also find yourself accepting abuse because your boundaries are porous. So you allow other people to abuse you and you say absolutely nothing about it, you know? You also may fear rejection. And so that means you go along with just about anything to get along. A healthy boundary is figuring out, how do I value my own thoughts, my own opinions, my own morals, while also communicating with somebody else, right? You don't compromise your boundaries when you have healthy boundaries. You know when to say no and you know when to say yes. You don't overshare information and you know how to accept when other people say no, and you know how to say no yourself, right? Healthy boundaries, porous boundaries, and rigid boundaries, all important to keep in mind. I'm going to put some information in the description box for you below. I encourage you to check out these two videos also if you want to learn more about this topic. Thank you so much for being with me in today's video. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you want to stick around with us, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.